All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th installment of California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. So it's a new chapter and a new chapter for the series. Over the next few weeks, our host, Elaine Chukan Brown, will lead conversations with some outstanding producers dedicated to illustrating California terroir through the lens of classic grape varieties: Zinfandel, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet Sauvignon. While the conversations offer a deep understanding of these varieties and the role they play in the history of California wine, more importantly, we hope that they reveal the new directions grape growers and winemakers are headed in the way they cultivate and work with them in the cellar. So today we have the privilege of welcoming Sarah Wuethrich of Maggy Hawk in Anderson Valley. So first, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. First, please ensure you have the Zoom screen set to speaker view. There should be an option to select it in the top right corner of your screen. And during the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use: a chat section as well as a Q&A section. So these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field because it can default to panelists. So that is important to note if you want all of your colleagues to hear what you have to say. And then there's the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and our guests to answer towards the end of the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, but please know any that are not answered live will be provided in the Q&A summary and the email that you'll receive following the program. So in this email, we will also provide a list of export markets for the wineries represented. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. And she was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the top 5 wine communicators of the year in the world the last 2 years in a row. And Sarah Wuethrich, she's winemaker at Maggy Hawk in the Anderson Valley, and her passion for Pinot Noir from this very special place is going to be the focus of today's webinar. So I'll hand it over to you, Elaine.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Elaine.
So nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to be on this webinar and share Anderson Valley with the world.
Well, I'm so thrilled to have you here to talk about Anderson Valley. Jancis and I were actually able to travel parts of Anderson Valley with you. That was earlier this year. It feels like ages ago.
Ages, but yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found as to be such a great example of how remote Maggy Hawk is just the story. You actually have what you call a bear block. Could you tell us what that means?
Sure, yeah. So one of the blocks at Maggy Hawk, it's at the far north end of the vineyard. It's the highest elevation block, and it's surrounded by the forest there. And it's basically a sacrificial block to the bears. They hop the fence, and they like to munch on the grapes just as they're ripe and right before we decide to pick them. So we call it the bear block.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we're here in California. People think of California as mostly a civilized place, but right there in the vineyard, there's actually bears coming in to eat the fruit.
Yep, bears, turkeys, all kinds of critters.
Well, let's go ahead and look at a map to help orient us to where Anderson Valley is located. Katie's done a great job bringing some maps together, as she always does. And first we like to just orient everyone, of course, to where we're talking about in the state of California. And as obvious as it is, it's important to remind all of us that's the Pacific Ocean there on the left. And part of why that matters is because California is actually made by a series of mountain ranges, and the role of the mountains and the ocean are really help define the growing conditions of any particular region. And so as we go into the North Coast, notice we're north of San Francisco Bay. If we could go to the next map, we can see here all the way down at the bottom is the city of Santa Rosa, which is right in the middle of Sonoma County. And So Sarah, one of the things you do regularly is drive from Santa Rosa to Anderson Valley. Can you just talk us through what we're seeing here on this map?
Sure. So my drive is about an hour and 20 minutes to the Maggy Hawk Vineyard. I head north on 101, and then just as I pass Cloverdale, I veer off to Highway 128 there. And it's about a 45-minute drive of switchbacks going over the hills. And
once you get onto 128, you mean?
Right. Yeah. It's really windy road, not for people who get car sick. So we pass through the Yorkville Highlands, which is excellent grape growing region for Italian varieties and Syrah. And then you open up into Anderson Valley. And I'm in such awe of this valley constantly, even to this day when I make that drive. You open up at the south end of Boonville, and on the left-hand side is covered with fir and other conifers. And on the right-hand side, on the East Ridge, you'll get rolling hills with dried grass and madrones and oak trees. Right. It's quite beautiful.
Well, and one of the things I love about these maps that Katie makes for us is that you can really honestly see the topography and the trees as you're talking about. So just to give people a sense of what we're looking at, anywhere you're seeing green, those are mountains covered in different types of evergreen fir trees. And so if we go to the next map that zooms in even closer, this map shows you how mountainous the surroundings of Anderson Valley are. And the very narrow brown stretch, that's the valley floor and eastern facing mountain slopes that you were just talking about. But notice how it's really, really quite a long, narrow valley and fully surrounded by mountains. And could you tell us the approximate size of Anderson Valley?
Sure. It's about 15 miles long and 1 mile wide. So
incredibly narrow.
Area. Yeah.
Incredibly narrow. And one of the things that's a little hard to see on this map, but that's really important to point out, is that the Anderson Valley is very much defined by one major river and also a series of creeks. And I know Katie can show us kind of where the Navarro River comes from this map. It goes all the way to the ocean there, coming out at the town of Mendocino, and creates a little canyon formation that goes all the way into the north part of Anderson Valley. And then there's a series of creeks through the valley. But could you tell us kind of the role that the river and the waterways through there play?
Sure. Yeah, it brings the cool coastal climate from Mendocino up and kind of is channeled through what we call the deep end there, where Maggy Hawk is located, and then gets funneled down into the valley. And, I would say, I think right where Philo is, the town of Philo, there's a perpendicular hill section that comes there, and it almost creates a break. So I would say anything north of that sees very cool climate, and it tends to be warmer down past further south east of the town of Philo, there where the Ferrington Vineyard is located.
Right. And so one of the things to point out here and clarify, so people locally in Anderson Valley refer to the deep end, which is meant to mean deepest into the mountains and kind of the tightest, narrowest part of the valley closest to the ocean. So where Maggy Hawk Vineyard is located, it is in the deep end. Right. And then when you say it's warmer in the south, we're really splitting hairs here, because this is a relatively cool region. And even in the south, it's very much still Pinot country.
That's correct. And I think it's important to note one of the main things that really makes this area prime for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay production is the diurnal shift that we see there. So, we will see 30 to 40 degree difference between daytime and nighttime temperatures, which is really key to growing wines for cool climate Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and sparkling wine production.
Right, keeping that acidity and freshness from those cool nights.
Yeah.
Well, and you were just talking about the marine influence, like the ocean influence, fog and cool air literally come in down that canyon from the ocean. Yeah. And you actually sent us a photo that illustrates that. Could we see that too, Katie? So go ahead and tell us what we're looking at here.
Sure. So this is another vineyard located on the East Ridge, and it's about 1,500 feet elevation looking down south towards the town of Boonville. And so it's just a good representation of, yes, we talk about cool climate. So the valley floor around the town of Boonville does see cooler temperatures. And then there are many vineyards planted higher on the eastern ridge that are above that fog line,
Right.
that do get a bit warmer and have closer proximity to the sun's UV light.
Right. One of the things that's really helpful for people to keep in mind is that even within one region, and a very small region like Anderson Valley, your elevation plays a super important role in that the diurnal shift you were just talking about is much greater and more obvious when you're below the fog line.
Yes.
And then if you're high enough elevation to be above the fog line, which
Right.
you in a lot of regions tends to be between 600 and 800 feet elevation.
Yeah.
Above the fog line, there's more light exposure, literal light exposure, and
Yep.
and warmer daytime temperatures, but also more even temperatures overall. So less temperature change over the course of a day and night.
Right. So, I mean, and that's the really cool part. I've had the opportunity to work with vineyards at all elevations, all north and south end of the valley, and you really do have to know the site because it varies so much, and it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing though, because when you start to understand those really subtle differences in terms of, are you closer to the ocean or further away? Are you higher elevation or lower?
Yeah.
You start to see how you can really dial in and fine tune the expression found in the wine, even just through one variety like Pinot.
Yeah, it's true.
It's a small region, but really varied.
Yeah.
And so let's go ahead and look at a photo of Maggy Hawk as well. Again, this is a vineyard located all the way north in Anderson Valley in what we call the deep end. But you can see how it's actually located on the western side, and part of the effect of that is it is really undulating, full of hills, really, really varied topography.
Yes. And that's been such a cool thing being a winemaker. When I first saw this vineyard, it was, I got a sense of awe and inspiration, much like, I've had the opportunity to travel the world, and I equate it to, seeing the Sistine Chapel or Machu Picchu, and you get a sense of reverence and awe, seeing the differentiation in the topography, just in a 58-acre vineyard.
Yeah, which is amazing. And it gives you a lot to work with, because each block, from what you've told me, is really varied in its style and expression.
Correct. Yeah. So we get a fruit from every single block, just about. And there's, a handful of Pinot Noir clones that make up that vineyard. And we vinify everything separately, really dissect each block.
Right. Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But one of the things that we could see in that previous photo was there were alternating vine rows. So some were tilled and some were not. Uh-huh. And that mix can be really important. It changes the soil temperatures. It helps with erosion control.
Yep.
One of the things I want to highlight, though, is Maggy Hawk is a long-standing vineyard and really speaks to some of the history of Anderson Valley. But also Maggy Hawk is owned by Jackson family, and Jackson has really made a very strong commitment to sustainability, and not just here in California, but really at an international level. And I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit, because I know it also plays into the commitments and farming practices you have there at Maggy Hawk. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I would love to. Preserving future agriculture for me is very important, and it's even more of a bonus that the company that I make wine for is also completely committed to that. Jackson family has sustainability measures across all of our vineyards throughout California, and like you mentioned, internationally. By that, it's moving away from any harmful glyphosate sprays in the vineyard, and being really cognizant of water usage. We are constantly monitoring drought here in California, so it's specifically important for us here. And we're not just watering vines just because. So I'm working closely with our vineyard manager, Mario Espinoza, and we're making sure that it's, really only critical times that we're adding water to the vineyard.
Right. And Jackson's actually partnered with the Torres family. Could you comment briefly on the initiative that they made together?
Yeah, they've partnered with the Torres family from Spain, and Katie Jackson is the daughter of Jess and Barbara Banky, Jess Jackson and Barbara Banky, and she's really been the spokesperson for the company. And it's just their commitment to maintaining sustainability across the vineyards internationally, making sure that we are properly caring for our land so that it is usable for years, decades, the next generation ahead. So I'm really proud of the company taking a stand and making sure that that's a priority for us as a company.
I know sometimes with the kind of wine lovers, wine community, people can really easily be skeptical of larger companies. And but one of the things that Jackson really illustrates is that larger companies also have resources that can be directed into larger initiatives, like you're talking about.
Yeah,
and
positive
I think
change for sure.
Yeah, Jackson's a really nice example of Jess and Barbara established this incredible company, and obviously Jackson family as a brand, really helped change the market in terms of California wine. But now with the second generation, the daughters are really saying, what can we do to take this brand and move it forward? And their focus on equity and sustainability is really a powerful example, because they can have a global influence because of the size, not just a local one.
Absolutely. And my hat's off to them for taking that on, because they don't have to, but it's a passion project for both of them. And I admire that very much.
Well, and I've spent some time talking to them about how they're working to create greater equity and support for vineyard workers as well. And it's another example of when you have the resources of a medium to large size company, you can choose how to direct those in various positive ways. Yeah. So, but as you were saying, you personally, and I take it part of why you've chosen to work with Maggy Hawk and with this company, you love Anderson Valley and the vineyard, but again, those you're really able to help advance the farming in this site to preserve the vines for a long time. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So Maggy Hawk was planted in 2001, and so it's coming up on its 20th year in production, and I want to see that age prolonged, and so anything I can do as a winemaker working with the wine growing team to preserve the vineyard and prevent replanting that's common in California. You don't see that so much in European vineyards, and I would like to bring that model back here to Maggy Hawk and really keep it going as long as it can.
Right. And the way you were talking about monitoring water and really thinking about, you were talking about how you've even changed pruning in the vineyards.
Yeah, so we moved from cordon to cane, and we're with the hope to getting more even, consistent fruit development and preserving the vines for longevity.
Right. Absolutely. So as a very geeky aside, just to explain why that's relevant, in another way, it helps change fruit development, but it also reduces the number of points that a vine needs to be cut every year, which means it reduces the chance of disease as well.
Right. Yeah.
Which is great. So let's go ahead and start talking about the wine, because of course that's the thing we get really excited about. So you've actually brought two Maggy Hawk wines, and then also wine from another producer, and I'm really excited to talk through the lineup. But let's go ahead and start with the first Maggy Hawk wine.
Sure. So the first wine is the 2017 Jolie. We have 4 Pinot Noirs from Maggy Hawk Vineyard, and the goal when I was brought on to the project in 2017 was the primary goal, was to make 4 very distinct Pinot Noirs, showcasing how diverse this one site can be. 58 acres, different clones, slope, aspect among all the blocks. And so the first wine here, the Jolie, is meant to be on, as we look at a color spectrum, more on the red fruit, higher acid end of the spectrum. And then we have the Afleet, which we'll taste next, the Unforgettable, and Stormin. And Stormin is meant to be on the blue, black fruit, higher intensity, higher oak, and more tannin.
Well, and I know you've talked about how you're able to work with the different blocks in the site, and that just the different placement on the hills or fog exposure and angle to the sun, those all change the flavor profile of the fruit itself. But you're doing some of that experimentation in the cellar too. And so as we move from Jolie to Afleet, there's a little bit of play with whole cluster, which is something people are really interested in understanding with Pinot. Could you speak to that as well?
Sure. So the Jolie is 100% single block, single clone. It's clone 115. And just kind of stepping back a little bit to your reference about separating portions of a block by slope and aspect. So we took the north and south facing vines and fermented them separately, aged them separately, and came up with this blend that is pretty much a 50-50 split between the two. The south-facing vines ripen earlier and have more jammy fruit characteristics. The north-facing have a bit higher acidity, more on the red fruit spectrum. I think it's a happy medium between the two. And then moving to the Afleet, that's where we called our whole cluster blend from the get-go. And this is kind of an experimentation in what whole cluster can do on an aged vineyard, and it is exceptional. It's really cool aromatics, but for me, I think whole cluster really brings texture to the table in wines, and I love the rustic tannin that I get from whole cluster, and that's in the next wine, the Afleet. So here we used 30% whole cluster. It's a combination of a couple different blocks, 115 clone and 667 clone Pinot Noir. And both of these wines were aged for 15 months. The Jolie saw just under 50% new oak, and the Afleet saw just under 30% new oak.
I think, though, there's so many points to highlight in what you just said. With whole cluster, a lot of times the conversation ends up coming around, how it changes the aromatics, or it adds a spice profile, that sort of thing. But your point about its effect on the texture and how it moves through the palate is so important. Because when I taste these two wines, just looking at the Jolie first, it's a single block, single clone wine. And I've actually been lucky enough to taste a lot of single clone wines, whether as barrel samples or in bottle. And they can often be a little bit simple. But one of the things you've accomplished through the sub-block blending, so to speak, is there's actually really kind of like this tonal range in the wine. So there's this, it is very red fruited, but there's this sort of deep tone element, that like
bass
is
notes,
yeah, exactly, like bass notes, and then it lifts all the way up to like that high acid, more nasal register, and so to get that on a single clone wine really speaks to the texture and undulation of that site that you mentioned. But then with the Afleet, there's kind of more different colors. But the other thing is I wouldn't say that it's more tannic. It's more that it kind of rests on the tongue a little more. And I don't mean heaviness. I mean the texture changes. There's a way in which suddenly what I focus on in the wine is the texture and the way it relates to my palate rather than just the flavors. And I think that's interesting. Yeah,
for sure. I often, when I taste, I like to think in shapes and colors. And it helps me, kind of articulate and pay attention and be present for that wine. And so I think what you're saying is just paying attention to how it sits on your palate. For me, that's, as a winemaker, aromatics are great. I think it's the first impression, and first impressions are very important. But for me, what I like to drink, what really gets me, to my core is the texture. So that's kind of what I'm looking for when I'm putting the blends together for Maggy Hawk.
I would say too, I feel like the whole cluster element here brings a kind of savory aspect.
Yes, there is that. You'll find that in Anderson Valley wines a lot. And I think there is a bit of that in the third wine that we'll taste too.
Right. So let's go ahead and pour the Baxter, because I know there's a whole cluster element in that wine. And part of what's interesting here is that My understanding is you've selected a wine that in a lot of ways actually is made similar to your Afleet, but it's from a very different part of the valley. And actually, as we start talking about Baxter, Katie, could we go ahead and look at the Anderson Valley map again too, so we can see where this wine is located? And maybe while we're getting the map up, Sarah, could you tell us, why did you select Baxter, and also then talk us through where it's located on this map?
Sure, of course. So Baxter Wines is the one-man production of Phil Baxter. He was a colleague of mine during our days at UC Davis Viticulture and Enology, and he's a small producer, does everything himself, and he sourced single vineyard wines throughout the valley, particular Ferrington Vineyard. I chose this wine because Ferrington is kind of one of the iconic vineyards of Anderson Valley. Many great wine producers source from there: William Sellium, Fell, Arista, and others. And I feel that I wanted to showcase a smaller producer and what their ability to translate that iconic vineyard. It's excellent. I admire Phil's wines. I think they're great representation of Anderson Valley Pinot Noir.
Well, and Ferrington really, Anderson Valley has actually quite a much longer history than I think people realize too. And Farrington's a good example of that. It was planted in the late 60s from what I recall.
That's right. Yeah. So it was planted in the late 60s. And then in the 80s, the Dr. Richard Ferrington purchased the vineyard. He did plant some suitcase cuttings there, which were virused. And during that time was, producing wine, but the vines were in decline, clearly. In the mid-90s, the Schoenemann family purchased the vineyard, who currently owns it and is very much involved. They have their own wine label, Fathers and Daughters, which Phil also helps make the wines for. And the Schoenemann family has really turned that vineyard around. Most of the 75 acres that's planted there is to Pinot Noir, multiple Dijon selections, UC Davis clones, 115, 667, 777. They also have some Badensville and 828 and Pommard. On top of Pinot Noir, they have Chardonnay, which I had the pleasure of working with when I was at Copain, and as well as Gewürztraminer and 1 acre of Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, which is amazing to have in such a cool climate region.
Right.
Yeah. But I think too, the Baxter really speaks to another aspect of Anderson Valley. It's geographically small, but it's also historically really been kind of built and maintained by a host of small production family owned properties. Yes. And as those smaller production vineyards and wineries have proven the quality of Anderson Valley, others have come in. And now there's actually even different owners from Napa establishing vineyards, and it's really expanding and shifting the understanding of Anderson Valley.
Yeah, the secret's out.
Yeah. But one of the things though, tasting this wine, I think it's interesting because I still get the textural element like we were talking about. And the wine is relatively light, but I feel like, going back to your comment about shapes and colors, I feel like the part of the difference is it spreads across the palate more.
Yeah, it's broad. I spoke with Phil about the winemaking behind this wine, and he ages this wine for 20 months in 100% neutral French oak, and he uses about 30% whole cluster. Phil does native, primary, and malolactic fermentation on all of his wines. So
it's really
a little bit different
wine.
than the Afleet. The Afleet, we also use 30%, but we did incorporate some new oak.
Right.
And again, two opposite ends of the valley. I think it's really fascinating to see the differences between the two.
Well, and one of the things that I think is really exciting about Anderson Valley right now is that you are actually part of a group of producers there in the valley that are doing intensive terroir study. Could you briefly talk to us about what's happening there and what you're discovering so far?
Yeah, would love to. We're a small kind of grassroots effort, winemakers and vineyard managers and grape growers, and wanted to give a shout out to my colleague Gillian Handelman, who has been a huge support in getting this moving forward. And collectively, we are looking at kind of defining better for ourselves to understand the valley what makes it so unique and how we can better talk about the different sections. As we mentioned before, the deep end is just one neighborhood of this valley that we're looking at, but we've kind of defined 5 unofficial subregions, starting at the south with Boonville. In the mid-valley is Palico, which is the Buntling term for phyllo. And then moving north to the deep end, then we also have the West Ridge and the East Ridge. So,
well, and just to clarify for people outside the area, Buntling is sort of the local lingo or dialect, so to speak. There's actually, Anderson Valley is remote enough that that it's actually developed its own
language.
Which is kind of crazy. And I think such an illustration of how it's only a few hours north of San Francisco, but actually, you know, when you factor in the mountains and the crazy road to get there, it actually turns into a region that's remote enough that people have their own language for the region and things they do and the different neighborhoods even.
Yes. It's a big part of the culture for Anderson Valley. Anderson Valley Brewing Company names a lot of their brews after Buntling terms. It's a lost art, I believe, and I think there are some families that are trying to keep it alive. So it is a rich part of the history, and one of the things that I very much love about the valley is its culture and community. People are fantastic there. Yeah,
it's really special to be welcomed into communities like that. Yeah. So in earlier this year, Gillian set up a tasting for Jancis and I. We tasted through about 20 Pinots from the region, each a different producer. And one of the things that really stood out to me was, again, that real fresh acidity was very consistent across producers and styles. And there was that sort of tonal range that we talked about. You know, you could get like really purely bright red fruit wines all the way to bluer and even a hint of black. I wouldn't say that I saw any that were really black flavor fruit profile, but you know, into deeper tone blue. But again, that acid signature seemed consistent to me. But could you speak to, you know, in your work as a winemaker, you've actually worked with regions all over the West Coast and you've tasted far broader. So you contrast for us, how does Anderson Valley compare to some of the other well-known Pinot regions, and how does it separate from them?
Yeah, I think that Anderson Valley, the climate for Pinot Noir is perfect. It allows for physiological ripeness and phenological ripeness to kind of go parallel in development, and that's, I feel, really important. Whereas warmer climate areas, like I would say parts of the Russian River Valley and, you know, Central Valley area, it doesn't allow that to happen as consistently. And so, you know, Russian River Valley, to me, I feel like the wines are very broad in the palate. They tend to be more jammy and riper in aromatics. I would say the closest to Anderson Valley would be Sonoma Coast Pinot Noirs. I really do enjoy Santa Rita Hills. I think its location being perpendicular and a completely east-west running valley is key to bringing that flow from the ocean in and cool climate and wind. But I think the surrounding topography, that it's sheltered by the East and West Ridge and its proximity to the ocean, I think more and more people are catching on that it is just stellar for Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. Hopefully more Chardonnay will be planted here in the future, because I think
there's amazing Chardonnay coming out of
it's going to be exceptional. Start seeing some of the Chardonnays coming out of there, and sparkling wine. I mean, Roederer's been doing it for decades.
Right. Well, and really one of the historic houses for sparkling wine in California established itself there in Anderson Valley, which speaks a lot to the growing conditions, because you have to have really elevated acidity and those cooler nights that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'll just clarify in saying the jamminess of Russian River, we're talking very much in comparison. So it's not that Russian River has jammy Pinot. It's that compared to the kinds of flavors you get from Anderson Valley. Yeah, I mean, I think of so with Santa Rita Hills, it's really common to get like a black tea element. Again, like really intense elevated acidity, really high tone, hits high in the mouth acidity, but then this black tea element. And then with Russian River, for me, the wines kind of fill the mouth more. They're not necessarily heavier or bigger, but they're just kind of spread and are broad, as you were saying.
Right.
You get more different colors of cherry, whereas with Anderson Valley, it's more like firm small berries.
There's a lot of tension in Anderson Valley wines, for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I like to say about Anderson Valley wines is that they don't need a lot of makeup. They're very beautiful, just naturally the way they are. So that's
something that comes up quite a lot with Pinot is the clonal conversation. I don't want to dwell on it too long, to be honest, because I've spent a lot of my life talking about clones.
I'm sure.
but just briefly, because I know people are interested in that. My understanding is Maggy Hawk has a mix of things, and then of course Baxter at Ferrington there, you were talking about really a mix of heritage and Dijon as well. Can you just briefly comment on, the role of Dijon clones versus the different heritage clones that we have with Pinot?
I wish there was more heritage clones planted up in Anderson Valley. We do have some Swan and Calera that I've seen, but typically what's planted up there is Wädenswil. It does really, really well. That's a Swiss-derived clone. And then we see mostly 667, 777, 115, I would say, are what's majorly planted up there.
But working with other regions as you have, do you think that is there a reason why those are the primary clones? Is it simply a coincidence of historic timing? Or is it that those simply do better, do you think, in the region?
I think it's kind of a safe bet. When people are establishing vineyards, it's a huge financial investment. And so, what's available to them way back in the 80s to plant isn't what is necessarily available now. And I think that, more of the selections are becoming cleaned up by the FPMS at UC Davis and available as plantings. And so I think when people were establishing vineyards back in the 80s, 90s, that those were kind of the safe bets as far as clones go for Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
I can't speak to everybody who plants,
no,
but
of course,
I know that those are, it's a fine line between wanting the production and wanting quality.
Right. One of the things that people sometimes don't realize is with the heritage clones, they often, because they're taking, just simple cuttings from site to site to site, they often carry a lot of virus, which makes them, which for some winemakers, some viruses mean, oh, you lower the yields and so you increase the concentration. But in a cooler region like Anderson Valley, when you're sort of compounding extremes, so you can have like the extremes of a virus plus the extremes of a cold region, can mean you're just literally not going to get any fruit.
And the soil is growing on, absolutely.
Right.
Combination of things.
Yeah, and so it can be really important to be quite careful about the combination there. One of the things that people are asking about too is just, climate change is a huge topic right now. That, of course, is part of why Jackson has made such a strong international commitment to the sustainability program. And have you seen, though, changes in how kind of fog is rolling through the valley or the diurnal shift? Are you seeing changes like that in the area?
It varies year to year. So in 18, it was essentially 2 weeks later in harvest pick dates than in 19. And so even year to year is variable. So how much rain we get, I'm going to be curious to see with this pandemic and the decrease in pollution, how I can already see a change in climate on a day-to-day basis. How is that going to affect growing seasons in the future overall? That'll be really interesting to study. But I think for winemaking, I tend to focus on year to year. Right. And that's what I've been seeing the last couple of years. It's so variable. And in 17, of course, we had the really bad fire up here in Sonoma County. So we're always worried going into harvest season, you know, are we going to bring all the fruit in before a fire hits? How's that going to work out?
Well, because the fire question ends up being more relevant because Anderson Valley does harvest later.
Yeah.
Too, right.
Yeah.
Can you
typically.
just give us a sense of that, the harvest timing contrast Anderson Valley compared to some place like Russian River?
Yeah. So for Maggy Hawk, specifically because it's further on the deep end, I know talking to Phil about the Ferrington vineyard, he typically harvests that vineyard the first week in September, Labor Day weekend. Whereas with Maggy Hawk, it'll be, you know, in 19, it was mid-September. In 2018, it was the end of September.
Yeah.
And so we're right butting up into that fire season, and it's a worry. And then you start getting into extremely cool nights. You start to see moisture in the air. So
ripening. Yeah.
the disease pressure increases, and these are all things that Mother Nature is throwing at us constantly. But I think that compared to other regions, Russian River, I think, has the capability to hang a good amount of time too. I think it all depends on the style that the winemaker is going for, and the picking decision that happens from that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so again, Anderson Valley is only about 15 miles long, north to south, and Ferrington and Maggy Hawk are only a few miles apart. Yeah. But you still, you know, with comparable styles of winemaking and picking decisions, it's actually a few weeks picking difference. Yeah.
It's pretty huge. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is amazing. So speaking to style a little bit, people are hoping to get a little bit more insight from you. And, you know, you've talked about how you really focus on texture. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned whole cluster is one of the things that you think helps bring texture. Yes. But can you comment a little bit on are there other things you do in the cellar, whether during fermentation or with lees aging or stirring or any of these other things that really inform the way the wine feels in the mouth?
Sure. So I think it starts with fermentation and the end of fermentation in particular. So we are using pump over specifically throughout all of our ferments, and right towards dryness, I'm checking the wines daily to check on extraction. And sometimes they'll sit in tank for more than 14 days, sometimes a little less, depending on what I'm seeing. Not only texturally, but color, aromatics. And then the next step, once it's pressed, once I determine that there's adequate extraction from the grapes and the skins in barrel, then we'll look at coopers. So I know I mentioned the Jolie has just under 50%, but to me, I don't get a lot of oak on the nose and in the flavor. And to me, that's really important, is to select coopers. It's not necessarily about percentage of new oak, but also the coopers that you're working with. Do they impact your wine greatly? And in some cases, we do use some more impactful coopers on the stuff that can take that. But on others, I like to use coopers that kind of support the wine and allow the aromatics and flavors to shine rather than the thumbprint of the barrel.
Well, and we were talking earlier too about how your barrel choice can even affect, like you were saying, the texture. So sometimes, like I was commenting with your wines, I feel like the way you're using the oak brings kind of a creamy element to the mid palate, you know, which is something people don't talk about as much too.
Right. And I think also barrel aging, the length of time that the wine spends in barrel, you know, I see a lot of people bottling after 9-10 months in barrel, and we're choosing, like Phil and I, 15-20 months. So it's over vintaging. It's spending an extra amount of time in barrel. And I think that allows for the wine to really extract from the oak and find a balance.
One of the things that was, you know, I've done harvest with a few different producers over the years. And one of the things that I was able to do is really focus in on Pinot, and they were very kind and generous, taking time with me to really understand the different stages in the cellar. And one of the things that was really impactful for me in my understanding was just going back to what you were saying about the end of fermentation and how much that changes. Yeah. And so in two different experiences with producers, specifically on Pinot, they had me taste not just every day, but twice a day,
Twice a day,
morning
yeah.
and evening, from almost dryness, almost the end of fermentation, to in some cases up to 2 or 3 weeks after fermentation. And because that was how they decided when to press the wine off the skins.
Yep.
And the thing that was really amazing was, for me, was again, getting to taste twice a day. I just vividly remember there would be a moment where you knew, it'd be like in the morning, you're like, oh yeah, no, it's pretty good. And maybe you could think about pressing, but then I vividly remember that experience of like, we went to taste ferments, and it was like from morning to that evening, it was like, oh my God, it's there. And it's very much like an experience. It's hard to explain.
You have that perspective though, because you were tasting it. And so you have something to kind of a reference point. And so, yeah, I get it. It's like when you are house hunting or
you just
shopping and you just walk in and you say, oh, this is it.
This is the one.
Yeah, it's an instinct you get. And so that's a lot of what winemaking is, honestly. And it comes with experience and trusting your instinct and paying attention. And that's honestly my approach with Maggy Hawk, is just to be a good listener. To listen to what the vineyard's telling me, listen to what the wine's telling me as it's aging in the cellar, and not trying to just, throw my agenda at it. So
one of the things that's, with winemaking and wine growing, we can talk, when we're in this kind of context, we can talk all about all these different techniques, all these different choices of things you can do. But one of the things I've really realized that you just said so beautifully is that you need to learn all the techniques and you need to think about all the choices. But a lot of the time you're not doing things. It's just that you're showing up and being present. And tasting over and over and looking at the vines over and over. And it's really ends up coming down to paying attention and listening, because then you recognize the moment rather than having to intervene and do things all the time.
Right. Yeah. I that's well said.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for making time to be here.
Oh, it's my pleasure and complete honor to be here speaking with you about Anderson Valley. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to really thank everybody that's here with us today. Some of you have been stalwarts, have viewed every single episode live as they're happening. Some of you even email us questions in advance. And it's really quite an honor to connect with people all over the world and to share this time with you. Thank you so much. And Sarah, I'm so grateful, because Pinot is one of the varieties that's really has such an important place for California, but really in the world of wine. And you're just the perfect person to give us insights on both the growing and the winemaking side. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Sarah. So just a reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all participants will receive an email with the link. And we hope that you'll join us next week to welcome Nicole Hitchcock of J Vineyards and Winery to talk about sparkling wine production in Sonoma County and the Russian River Valley. That's next Tuesday, June 23rd at 10 a.m. Thank you all.